Thank you. Well, as Ann mentioned, I'm going to talk about the Chafee program, which was created by the Chafee Foster Care Independence Act of 1999, which provided $140 million for transitional services to youth aging out of foster care. And I should note that was $140 million in 1999 that has not been changed to this day. Part of the program allows states to use 30% of their allocation to provide housing support, room and board, for youth after they age out until their 21st birthday. And the law was very flexible in terms of leaving it up to states to define what would be covered under room and board, and there's a fair amount of variation, but we're going to talk about what's sort of a fairly typical, what we saw across different states. The study, as I mentioned, was done for Office of Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation with Laura Radel, and we basically used public documents, and then we talked with primarily IL coordinators as well as some other key informants to learn how they were spending their Chafee dollars explicitly for providing housing support. This was based upon fiscal year 2010 and based upon the plans that states submitted to the Children's Bureau for how they were going to spend their funds. We identified 20 states that were going to use the full 30%. So that means 30 states in the District of Columbia were not going to use their full 30% possible allotment. But because we wanted to know how states actually spend Chafee dollars as opposed to how they do just provide housing support in general, we wanted to focus on the states that really were spending as much as they could of their Chafee allocation. And 17 of those 20 states actually participated in the study. So what I'm going to cover basically is what kinds of housing assistance do these states use their Chafee funds for, as for youth who have aged out? What eligibility criteria do they use? Who are the youth that they help with their Chafee funds? And sort of what is the philosophy we heard from IL coordinators that kind of drive the decision on defining that eligibility and the type of assistance that's given? So this is kind of small. These are the 17 states that participate in the study. And remember, this is fiscal year 2010. So of these 17 states, they were planning to spend roughly $20 million of their allocations. This is 30% states. They're going to spend $20 million for housing support. And then what I put in the next column is the number of youth who had aged out in the previous year from those states. And it was about 15,000 at that time. And so if you think about the fact that this money is actually supporting 3 cohorts, not just one, so you basically multiply that number by 3, and that tells you that somehow they were going to serve 45,000 youth with $20 million. Now, obviously, not every youth needs housing support or needs the same amount of housing support, so really that's not going to be the right number to think about, but no matter how you think about it, it's going to be small dollars available for the youth who need help with housing support. And if you looked at 2013 numbers, since the dollars aren't really changing, and you saw on Amy's slide, the number of youth aging out has been decreasing, but that amount of decrease wouldn't change the general notion that even to give a modest amount of support, you probably couldn't support more than, say, about, I'll say 15% of all the youth who are aging out with Chafee funds. What states mostly do is provide some kind of monetary support for rental assistance. Some give it directly to landlords, some give it to the youth. There's some difference in philosophies there, but I'm not going to really focus on that. But youth, while some states do have some site-specific locations, mostly it's up to the youth to find a place to live, and generally it might be a shared apartment. Some places, some youth live alone, and some states actually won't let you share, though that's not as common. States also typically do offer some type of non-monetary housing assistance, helping find an apartment, filling out the housing application, and then developing a budget, which actually is very common and considered by most states to be a really important part of the exercise. The three main ways states use their funds then are either to provide startup costs, moving costs that anyone needs to be able to first move into your first place that you live in. Second, some kind of monthly rental assistance. And third, emergency assistance. The startup assistance can vary, but typically covers the things here: furnishings, deposits, first month's rent, what you need for utility hookup, appliances, application fees. And not every state covers all these things, and even within those, they still define things like which furnishings they're going to cover, or which appliances, if they cover them, which ones. But these do kind of characterize in general what states cover. And the range is somewhere between, from what was between about 500 for the lowest state to 2,000 for the highest state. And that's, again, just to move in. One way, though, that some states were using this money, so is where they'd leverage it with other programs, and particularly one example would be the Family Unification Program, or FUP, that we'll be hearing about more this afternoon, but where in that program, FUP provides a voucher for subsidized monthly rental assistance, and then the state can use its Chafee funds to provide those moving costs that the FUP voucher wouldn't cover. When they do provide monthly rental assistance, which most do, there tends to be an inverse correlation between how much they provide in startup costs and how much they provide in monthly rental assistance. So there's definitely a difference there. Depends somewhat, some of it's a philosophy, but some of it's also what other resources they have available for covering one versus the others, as to whether they tend to have higher startup costs or higher monthly rental assistance. But most of them do base it then on a youth's income and needs. So if the youth has some income, they'll frequently be required to pay part of the rent. And the higher their income, the less help they're probably going to get out of Chafee. And usually someone, a case manager, transition worker, sits down with the youth and works through a budget with them, figures out what they're going to need, and then figures out what their income is and uses that to determine the amount of subsidy they get from Chafee funds. What's very common, too, is a step-down approach. So some states will provide this kind of support all the way till the 21st birthday, but much, much more common is you only get support for about a year. And even during that year, a number of states step down where maybe the first 2 months they pay the full rent, and then they start lowering the amount of rent they cover, with the idea that after a year, or in some cases as short as 6 months, the youth's in a position where they're expected to take over the full amount of the rent and the utilities and all their payments. When we talk about emergency assistance, this tends to be in the context of youth who are already housed. So there will be situations where the idea is they're trying to prevent the youth from becoming homeless, but these are already youth who have been housed. So it's not quite like a youth who's aging out and is about to be homeless. They're going to be helped, hopefully, in some other way. But the emergency funds out of Chafee are more like someone loses their job and they need help until they can find a new job, or some other event occurs in their life and they just need some help to bridge a gap. In terms of eligibility, because the funds are so small, states feel like they have to come up with some eligibility criteria and really limit or ration who gets help with their Chafee funds. And so typically, first off, you have to have been in care at age 14. So youth who entered foster care at later ages won't be eligible for any housing support. Generally, you have to agree to participate in aftercare services or meet with the case manager. This varies a little by state of what the setup is, but essentially you have to be involved still with people from the system or maybe from the community. And the type of services are offered vary anywhere from basic IL services that are sort of there for those transition age youth regardless, all the way to sometimes much more intensive services like intensive mental health counseling but that's obviously much less common. And then the big thing is this, as I mentioned a minute ago, these caseworkers will sit with the youth and work out a transition plan, and not transition out of care, that should have already happened, but transition out of needing assistance. So figuring out, how are you going to take over this rent? What do you need to do that? And work out that plan with them and stay with them to figure that out. So as I said, youth sort of have to demonstrate not just why they need Chafee funds, but the sort of the amount of need they require. And because this support can't last very long, as I said, they have to have a plan for how they're going to pay the rent and utilities and basically live after the subsidy ends. And as a result, they really have to be in a position almost from the beginning to do that. Not all states require you to be in that position literally up front, but the plan you have better be something that is solid, like you're going to go to school and it's just you haven't started yet. So generally these youth are either in school and they're getting some kind of other support, scholarships or something that allows them to survive on their own, or they're working. And so it really has narrowed down to those who are in the best position to look after themselves. And that sort of all then derives from this philosophy that, and going back to this point, that really it's all about the fact that most IL coordinators feel that there just isn't much funding there and they can't stretch it very long. And so they want to make sure that since they can't support the youth very long, that that youth will be in a position to take care of themselves. And therefore, and they don't want to take some youth who, at the end of support, finds himself homeless, that they consider setting the youth up for failure. So they do couple this with working with the case manager, but essentially they're getting the money to youth who are going to do well once the support ends. Before my concluding slide, I did want to mention just a few things, because I think these don't come up in any of the other presentations. So you will hear about, these are some other housing resources that are targeted transition-age youth. You will hear a lot about the Family Unification Program, but I mentioned that because, as I said, sometimes states do couple their Chafee funding with their use of FUP. Educational and training vouchers, ETVs, youth are eligible for up to $5,000 for post-secondary education or training, and that's to cover attendance costs, which can include room and board. In fact, in a lot of states, if you're getting an ETV, they won't give you Chafee funds. In some other states where they'll use Chafee funds as a bridge, ETV might cover you while enrolled, and then during the summer when you're not, they might use their Chafee funds there. So that's some of those other types of, I don't know if you call that emergency usage, but what I call gap bridging. Of course, there are state-funded programs, and big one is California's THP Plus. And then Title 4E, which now that under Fostering Connections, states can extend foster care to age 21, and then Title 4E can provide the housing support instead of Chafee. So back to concluding about Chafee. As I said, in fiscal year 2010, there were only 20 states that took the fully allowable 30%. 15 states in DC actually put in $0, and then other states in between. We didn't ask anybody, since we were talking to states that were putting out 30%, we didn't find out why others weren't. In some other work, I've had it come up in discussion, so I don't have anything systematic. Some states feel they have other housing resources. Some states say they've tried to use their Chafee funds, and they don't get a lot of youth taking it, and what it ends up being is because of these eligibility requirements that they either don't want to stay involved with case managers, or they're not going to be able to, they're not working, they're not going to be able to take over the rent, so they don't take up the funds, which they may not have been eligible for anyway. And as I said, there are three main uses: startup costs, short-term rental assistance, and or emergency assistance, but that the eligibility criteria that get applied really then end up steering the Chafee funds to those youth who are already functioning best. That is, they're either have jobs in school or about to start jobs or go to school, and they are able to sit with the case manager and work out an adequate transition plan. If you'd like the report, well, actually, it's in your folder, I think, but pick the urban site or the ASPE website, same report.